When I played Sacred Stones as a kid, I had played Fire Emblem 7 once, and I hadn't been privy to any of the marketing material for the new game coming out. And when I got it, the beginning felt like familiar territory, but when I reached the end of Chapter 8 for the first time and they asked me which lord I wanted to go with, it sort of blew me away. Even though Fire Emblem 7 had route splits, if you only play the game once, it's easy not to notice them. This was the first Fire Emblem game in the US that explicitly asks the player which route they want to take, and I sort of fell in love with the concept. There's something compelling about making a choice, sort of like picking your starter in Pokemon or whether you save Peach or Zelda in Subspace Emissary in Smash Bros. Brawl. It's not a coincidence that half the time someone mentions playing Three Houses or Sacred Stones, the first question people tend to ask is either who did you S support or oh, what route are you playing? And this is because route splits give the player a great chance to express themselves. They're very interesting because they're an exception to Fire Emblem's generally rigid level structure. In most Fire Emblem games, you have a lot of freedom in how you approach maps, what units you use, and how you make use of your resources. And this is a stark contrast to the narrative, which is pretty close to the opposite most of the time. You go from map to map in order with dialogue between maps that you have no control over in old games and very limited control over in some of the newer games. Route splits shake this up a bit by giving you a meaningful decision that will shape both the gameplay and the narrative that the player experiences, at least for a chapter or two. Sometimes the narrative impact of these route splits can be minor, such as in Fire Emblem 7, and sometimes they can be pretty substantial, such as in Sacred Stones or Three Houses. Beyond that, route splits also inject some uniqueness and variety into a playthrough. In Fire Emblem 6, there are 2 small route splits leading to 4 possible combinations of maps for the player to go through. It's likely that my first playthrough will be a little different than yours, and that's exciting. And usually these splits have at least slightly lasting consequences. If one of us goes to the A route of FE6's first route split and the other one of us goes to the B route, we don't just experience different maps in the moment, we also get different units. I get Echidna, well you get Bartray, and if either of us uses these units, then the route split will influence the rest of our playthrough, both by providing a unique unit for our army, but also by providing unique support conversations with that unit. And units don't have to be the only thing that can differentiate one route from another either. Unique items, such as Thracia giving you an extra Vojax on its B route, or interesting bits of story that aren't essential to the understanding of the main plot, can make route splits both a compelling reason to replay a game, as well as an interesting choice from a narrative and mechanical perspective. I vividly remember when I was a kid learning that there were 2 versions of Pale Flower of Darkness because my friend got a different one than me, and that was sick. It made me want to replay the game and try to get that other route. And similarly, when I learned that if I trained my lords enough to get the Linus version of Four-Fanged Offense, I could get a cool warrior instead of Wallace, that was a reason to play FE7 a third time. The new maps, unit supports, and story were great ways to spice up replays while also making my first playthrough feel distinct from everyone else's. Of course, like any Fire Emblem feature, route splits have not always been done in the same way from game to game, so let's look at each route split in the series, see what they do well, and for fun, give them a little ranking. Our first sort of route split is in Gaiden, where you can choose to either fight Sonia or Dean and recruit the other. The split is 1 map long and doesn't have any major impact on the story. The reason I say it's sort of a route split is that I think you can actually play both maps if you retreat from one before killing the boss and then go do the other one. Not 100% sure on that, so if there's a Gaiden head watching this video, feel free to confirm or correct me in the comments. But if we treat this as a route split, it is a fairly dull one, but acts as a blueprint for the rest of the series. Neither version of the map is particularly interesting, with Dean's being a largely featureless desert full of sword dudes, while Sonia's is the exact same desert, except you start on the other side of it and it's full of witches instead. Dean's version of the map is much easier, as you can use the desert to your advantage versus his physical units with 1 range, but Sonia's witches can just warp around, putting your army at a mobility disadvantage. Neither version of the map is particularly memorable, but the split does still inject a choice for the player to make that was novel for the series at the time. Still, I can't give it too high of a ranking since I like every route split in the series more than this one. I'm gonna put it in our baseline here. This is the bare minimum of a route split, but even something simple like this is still fun and injects some variety into the playthrough. Our first more substantial route split appears in Fire Emblem 5, Thracia 776, and this one really starts on the map prior to the route split. The premise of that map is that we have arrived at a mountain pass and need to choose a direction to proceed in. One of our advisors, Augustus, wants us to go east through a dangerous forest where people are known to lose their way in order to avoid the bulk of the enemy forces, while our other advisor, Dorius, wants us to take the main road to the west, essentially charging directly into the enemy. For the first time in the series, though, Leaf doesn't decide on his own, we decide for him. And since this is Thracia, you know there's going to be some gameplay story integration. We make our route choice on the map. We can either escape to the west or the east, which determines the road that we take and the route that we go on. The map is honestly sort of whatever, but it's noteworthy as the beginning of the series' first major route split. This map is also just the kind of thing that Kaga loved doing, taking mundane experiences or moments and placing them into gameplay. In this map, there's still a little bit going on gameplay-wise, with the two paths being blocked by small groups of pretty weak enemies, and there's an event at the top of the map including a recruitable character. But it's a pretty pedestrian map outside of the big choice to go left or right. Kaga would go a little further in his turning mundane experiences into maps in Tearing Saga, where Chapter 15 is literally a marketplace with no enemies. What's neat about Thracia's route split, though, is that the dialogue before the chapter where you choose the path gives you a pretty good idea of what you're getting into with each route, provided that you paid attention. If you go into the forest where people get lost, you go to a forest map with invisible warp tiles. Well, if you go the other way, which Dorius tells you is full of soldiers, you get a very combat-heavy map. So the maps that you go to match the expectations set by the pre-map dialogue. It's a very elegant way to set the player's expectations for the upcoming route split without taking you out of the experience or talking to the player directly. It feels closer to stepping into Leaf's shoes and making an important decision than other route splits in the series. Another thing I like about this route split that I touched on earlier is that it has meaningful implications even after you're finished with it and go back to playing through a linear series of chapters for the rest of the game. If you take the route on the road, you undoubtedly get the stronger recruitable character, picking up the Bishop Sleuth, and provided that you aren't using Olwyn, the Mage Knight Ilios, who is also solid. You can also get a Pegasus Knight named Misha, though you're decently likely to struggle with that recruitment on your first playthrough, as you'll need to put her to sleep and you may or may not have the means to do so. Sleuth is the crown jewel of this route, providing a free high-rank staffer with enough skill to not miss with staves in a game where staves are awesome. He's an easy plug-and-play unit in any army, and even if you have a lot of other staffers, he can step in when they fatigue. Ilios and Misha are more replacement level, but I really like Ilios as a rare recruitable Mage Knight, so in this route you get one really good unit and two that are in the range of serviceable to pretty good. The other route, through the forest, gives us units of lower quality. We pick up Shanam, who is literally a joke character, and Miranda, who is a very underleveled mage that doesn't even promote to Sage, so she doesn't get those sick promotion bonuses to patch her up. However, what this route lacks in recruitable characters, it makes up for with powerful items that you can pick up, including a second Vogue that Orson really appreciates. So this route split provides an immediate different experience with the two different maps on each side, but it also provides resources that will impact the rest of your playthrough. It is a pretty short route split, lasting just 2 chapters, and I think that can make it act as less of an incentive to replay the game compared to FE games with longer route splits, because a lot of people won't want to replay 15 to 20 chapters just to play 2 chapters that they missed on their first playthrough. So in this case, the strength of the route split is mostly giving the player a bit of agency in the narrative and making that player's choice ripple through the rest of the game, either through a powerful new character or powerful new items and equipment. I do also like how the routes provide very different gameplay experiences. The route on the Western Road offers more traditional Fire Emblem gameplay, while the forest route is a bit more of a funhouse, including things like invisible warp tiles, a recruitable character that casually warps around every few turns, and a castle that can be seized almost entirely by using green units. For this reason, I often refer to the forest route as the funny route, so if you do replay Thracia, you get a very different experience depending on which route you choose. On the whole, I think this is a really strong route split. The game does a great job of informing the player that they are making a choice and what that choice entails, and your choice feels impactful both in the immediate term with the different maps and long term because each route offers meaningful rewards, but different rewards. Plus, I like 3 of the 4 maps, so this one goes in the banger tier. The games immediately after Thracia, 6 and 7, also feature short duration route splits, but they remove the obvious choice for the player. In 6, the first route split is determined by whether or not you visit the rightmost house in Chapter 9, and later in the game, whether you go to Ilia or Sakai is based on whether you trained your Pegasus Knights more or your Nomads more. To be honest, I haven't played FE6 in a while, so I'm going to be judging the maps partially on memory here, but I remember liking the A route a lot in the first route split. Hero of the Western Isle is a really cool chapter with tons of side objectives where it's interesting and challenging to get all of them, and it gives us one of my favorite Fire Emblem units in Echidna. But I don't remember thinking the B route was bad either, and its exclusive character Bartray isn't bad by any means. It feels like there's actually a meaningful choice between those two characters if that's the main factor by which you are choosing which route you play, and if you play to FE7, it's fun to see Bartray again. The later route split is somewhat infamous, mainly for the Sakai half of it, which oddly enough was used to represent FE7 and Lyn in Fire Emblem Engage. I actually don't think this route is that bad, especially if you remembered to bring along some bulky units, but I do play the Ilia route more often, mainly because I tend to train the Pegasus Knights more by default, and also Yuno is really pretty and I like Zealot, so it would be kinda messed up if I didn't recruit his partner. My only real issue with these route splits is that the requirements are a little bit esoteric, enough so that it doesn't really feel like you're making a choice on your first playthrough. In Thracia, you have a very good idea that a route split is coming up, how you're picking which route you're going to go to, and what those routes might be like. In 6, you really don't have nearly as much context to make a decision and may not even know that you're making a decision. You certainly wouldn't know that the game is going to split based on which units you chose to train. To be fair to FE6, forcing a route split without direct input from the player isn't necessarily a bad thing. The most obvious benefit of it is that you can use a route split to make sure that you serve the player the route that is most relevant to the characters they're using. Sakai and Ilia is a great example of this. If you trained the Pegasus Knights, it's reasonably likely that you like them, at least a little bit. So it probably leads to a good player experience more often than not if you send the player that trained the Pegasus Knights to the route that is relevant to the Pegasus Knights as characters, and includes the last member of their triangle attack. And the opposite goes for Sakai. If you chose to use the Nomads, it makes sense that you go to the route that is more relevant to the Nomads. A mysterious route split requirement that the player's not immediately aware of can also be fun sometimes. When I was a kid, I used to love trying to figure out how to get all of the route splits in Star Fox 64, which often had some pretty esoteric requirements. I think the reason I like it in Star Fox and not in Fire Emblem, though, is that most of the Star Fox route split conditions are based on you doing something exciting or challenging, like flying through the arches at the beginning of the first level. So it was usually fun trying to just experiment on Star Fox levels and see if you could unlock a different route. But I think these unit training requirements for route splits in Fire Emblem are missing that fun experimentation aspect, particularly since a Fire Emblem run can be really long. So it's pretty time-consuming to do a bunch of additional playthroughs just experimenting and trying to figure out how to get the route that you didn't get on the first playthrough. I do think there is some interesting design space that a route split the player isn't aware of can allow. In addition to making sure the player goes to the most thematically satisfying map for them, it can also be used to tailor the challenges the player faces to their army. For example, if you wanted to, say, challenge a player that has invested a lot in wyverns, you could send them to a map with a lot of ballistae only if they've given a certain amount of levels to flyers. Or if they've invested a lot in armors, you could send them to a map with a lot of mages. The opposite is also true. If you want to make a map that's loaded with archers and ballistae, but you don't want to be too mean to a player whose army is mostly flyers, you could use a route split to send the flyer-heavy army to a different map, maybe one that takes advantage of their abilities like a desert. So you can use a route split to present challenges to the player that are either amenable to their army composition or challenging to their army composition. I don't know that any of the mainline Fire Emblem games have really used their route splits with this intent, but I think it's an interesting idea. Overall, I'm going to give FE6's route split a rating of pretty good. I don't think the requirements for the routes are the most interesting, but I appreciate how the Sakai-Ilia split requirement is set up to send you to the place you're more likely to be interested in based on the characters you use. Plus, I think the first route split maps are really good, and even if I don't love the maps in the second route split, it kind of balances out to a pretty good experience. FE7 has a pair of route splits as well, and their requirements are similar to the Sakai Ilia route split from FE6. The first map with a split is Four-Fanged Offense, and which version of that map you get is based on whether or not your lords have gained a combined 50 levels or not, and the second is Pale Flower of Darkness, which is dependent on whether you trained your Guiding Ring users more or your Hero Crest users more. These route splits do fulfill the goal of giving the player a different experience and personalizing their playthrough a bit, but I don't like them as much as the Ilia Sakai route split in FE6. In that game, the route split being based on what units you use made some sense. Handling the split in that way made sure that the player was more likely to go to the route that was relevant to the characters they were using. FE7's route split doesn't really have that underlying flavor. Your Hero Crest and Guiding Ring users have nothing to do with either snow map on the Pale Flower of Darkness route split, and Four-Fanged Offense's route split doesn't really speak much to the training that your lords have done. It also helped that in FE6 the Nomads and the Pegasus Knights were all pretty good, meaning that the route a first-time player goes to could really be either one because all of the units that impact the route split are appealing. I don't have any numbers to go off of to make this prediction, but I kind of suspect that in FE7, most players get the Kenneth version of Pale Flower of Darkness on their first playthrough, because the suite of Guiding Ring users you have are all decent to good, while most of your Hero Crest users are on the meh side, except for Raven, of course, who I love. At the very least, almost everyone is going to be at least using one of the staffers, which gives the Guiding Ring team a little bit of a bump. I guess there's nothing really wrong with one route being more common than the other, but to me this route split is just a little bit lacking. The condition that determines which route you go to just feels completely random, and I don't really like that. The Four-Fanged Offense route split, on the other hand, I don't love simply because I think the level requirement is really high. Even if you are using all three lords, getting them a collective 50 levels is pretty demanding, especially if you elected not to play Lin mode. When I watch playthroughs of FE7, it's pretty rare that I see the Linus version of this map, and that's whether I'm watching an experienced player or a new player. Which is a bit of a shame because I think it gets you a more interesting recruitable unit in Geats compared to Wallace. So I'm mostly negative on the route split conditions in FE7, but I do think they can at least add some interest on a second playthrough once you know they exist, because then they can actually impact decision making. And this is true for FE6's Ilia Sakai split as well. It's not uncommon in that game to see someone choose not to use one of the Nomads or choose to use an additional Pegasus Knight because they prefer Ilia to Sakai. I think this is an interesting decision point. I've seen some people say they don't like it because they feel pressured not to use a certain unit so that they can get the route they want. But to that I say, if you really loved Sue, you would just go to Sakai. It's not that bad, I promise. The same logic applies to FE7, where sometimes people will limit the number of Hero Crest users they use to go to their preferred version of Pale Flower of Darkness. I've even seen players kill one of their fighters to reduce the amount of Hero Crest experience they have just before the route split. Another funny wrinkle to this route split is that if you want to do full recruitment, Bartray has to be trained to promoted level 5 in order to recruit Carla. So if you want to recruit everyone, and go to the Guiding Ring version of Pale Flower of Darkness, you're gonna have to factor in Bartray getting a bunch of EXP, and I think that can make for interesting decision making. The Lord level requirement for the Linus version of Four-Fanged Offense also becomes a little more interesting on subsequent playthroughs. Provided you are interested in going to the Linus version of the map, getting your lords 50 levels in time becomes an interesting challenge, and I think it's fun to use all of the lords from time to time, so it's nice to be rewarded for doing so with a beautiful Axeman. Still, for this type of route split, I think FE6 did it better by having the routes be related to the characters whose EXP determined which route you went to. As for the actual maps in FE7's route split, I'm not overly fond of most of them. The Hero Crest version of Pale Flower of Darkness is pretty miserable. It's a big, snowy route map with lots of reinforcements. Not particularly difficult, but it sure does take a while. The other version of the map is also a snow map, but a significant portion of it is indoors. I actually think this map is fairly inoffensive, but it's not very memorable or exciting either. Four-Fanged Offense, on the other hand, is certainly memorable, in both good ways and bad. The Lloyd version of the map is pretty tricky. It's a fog of war map with a moving boss that is difficult to double, can be pretty dodgy, and packs a punch. So it's pretty easy to get caught unaware on your first run of the map, which can force a reset. The upside of a boss moving is that if you find the map too difficult, you can always attempt to end it early by just baiting the boss over to you on turn 1 or 2, as it is a kill boss map. However, you may not want to do that because there are lots of goodies on the map, including Wallace, who returns from Lin mode here, although I am being pretty generous in referring to him as a goodie. This version of the map can be pretty frustrating on the first couple playthroughs, but once you're aware of the boss and the wyverns that are in the fog, I think figuring out the best way to get everything done on this map on subsequent playthroughs can be fun. And I appreciate that the side objectives, including Wallace and 2 villages, are nice, but not so important that you feel bad if you decide you want to just kill the boss and get out of the map to have an easier time. The other version of Four Fanged Offense features Linus as its boss, and this map is a lot more straightforward. Like Lloyd's version of the map, it's a kill boss map, but there's no fog and Linus doesn't move. The only really tricky part is that there are villages under attack on opposite sides of the map, so you'll need to split up and get moving provided you want to protect both of them. Like the other version of this map, this one also has a recruitable character in Geats, and Geats is definitely the more exciting of the two. His bases are pretty solid right off the bat, and I prefer Warrior to General in FE7, plus I like his hair. Linus's map isn't bad, but it just doesn't really stand out. It's less frustrating than the Lloyd version of the map on an initial playthrough, but at least the Lloyd map can be interesting to play around on future playthroughs, whereas I don't think I've ever had a particularly interesting playthrough of the Linus version of the map. I will give both versions of this map a bit of a bonus for having a small impact on the rest of the game though, because whichever boss you don't fight here reappears later as the boss of Cog of Destiny, and I think that's cool. Overall, FE7's route splits are a little meh to me. The requirements aren't the most interesting, the Linus map is harder to access than I would like, and none of the maps are favorites of mine. Special negative shout out to the Jeremy version of Pale Flower of Darkness, which is one of my least favorite maps in FE7. And so this one will be ranked in the meh here. While I might be meh on FE7's route splits, next up is the game with my favorite route split, Sacred Stones. Sacred Stones begins with the player controlling Erica's army as they seek out her brother Ephraim. But once they meet up, they are sadly forced to split apart again, with the player being asked which of the siblings they would like to accompany. This route split is longer than any of the previous ones, with each route having 6 completely unique chapters, and the 2 maps after those being slightly varied depending on which route you played. Despite this route split being longer than others in the series up to this point, there actually aren't that many unique characters on each route. Your entire army minus the other lord join you at the start of the route regardless of which lord you pick, and each route only has 2 unique characters, with all other ones appearing in both routes. And I'm even being a little generous in saying that Ephraim route gives you 2 unique characters, because one of them joins in the cutscene after the final map of the route split, so there is no difference in the amount of chapters you have that unit for, regardless of which route you pick. In the past, I have often heard Erica route be described as the easier of the 2 routes, but with less interesting maps, while Ephraim route is referred to as the more challenging route with more interesting maps. I'm not going to go through every map one by one, mainly because I already did that, link in the description if you want to see that, but I think the maps in both routes are pretty similar in quality overall. Ephraim route is probably a little harder than Erica route because I think Phantom Ship is the hardest map in the route split. But I don't think the difference in difficulty is that considerable. If you're playing FE8 for the first time, I think you should just pick the lord you like best and go with them. With this route split being longer than any previous route split, it also stands to reason that it has a larger impact on the story than any previous route split. You get to spend a lot more quality time with the lord that you choose to follow, and certain supporting characters have more or different narrative beats depending on the route you choose. A couple of my favorites in Erica route are Cormag, who gets goaded into furiously attacking Erica by Volter claiming that Erica killed his brother, and Joshua, who is secretly the Prince of Johanna, benefits from Erica's route going through Johanna in Chapter 14. His excellent boss dialogue with Kalak hits a lot harder if you actually got to witness the death of Ismare in Chapter 14. The character that changes most from route to route, though, is the game's antagonist, Leon. In Erica route, Leon is presented as a man with a shred of humanity left, fighting against the Demon King that aims to consume him. Whereas in Ephraim route, he is presented in a much more overtly evil way. Even if you just play one route, this difference is hinted at by Ephraim and Erica having very different understandings of Leon's situation after the route split when they joined together. Erica is convinced that they can save Leon, while Ephraim seems much more resigned to the idea that his friend Leon might already be gone. Part of this is our lords just having different personalities, but it's also supported by them having different experiences with Leon during their routes. I really like the plot differences in this route split because they feel meaningful and additive when you do a second playthrough, but they don't make you feel like your first playthrough is incomplete. The second playthrough will just add additional context and let you see some moments that were exposited in the first route you played, but it's firmly something that just adds replay value. Your first playthrough will stand alone regardless of which route you went with. It's also nice that they give you several chapters to get to know Erica before the route split, though for me that made the route choice pretty lopsided, as by the time I had to make that choice, I felt like I barely knew Ephraim. Well, I really liked Erica already. He does get one chapter before the route split, but I think he would have benefited from one or maybe two more chapters. The ROM hack Sacred Stones Reforged adds one more Ephraim chapter, and I thought that was a good change. I also would have liked it if your roster differed a bit more from route to route, because it really doesn't make sense for Seth to leave Erica or for Kyle and Ford to ditch Ephraim. I understand they don't want you to lose any characters that you may have invested in, but it feels very gamey that everybody just ditches the lord that you don't decide to follow. It's also noteworthy that having lengthier route splits does place some limitations on the game. FE8 feels like a much shorter game than its GBA compatriots, and that was probably because of the route split. One can easily imagine that if the game didn't have a route split, it might have been 5 or 6 chapters longer. Personally, I like the choice and variety that the route split adds, and I like the replay value that the route split adds to the game, but if you really only like one route or are only going to play the game once, I could see why one might not like a lengthier route split. Overall, I really like this route split. The chapters are fun on both sides, and the changes to the story matter but don't make you feel like you need to do a whole second playthrough if you don't want to. Like I said at the beginning, it's my favorite route split, so it's going to be going into the best tier. And it's a while after FE8 before we have another route split. The Tellius games don't have them, and the Arcanea remakes after that don't have them, and Awakening doesn't really have them either, although Awakening and the Arcanea games do have optional guidance and paralogs which can fill a similar niche. But the next real route split is in Fates. Fates' route split was very ambitious when the game came out because rather than being 1 or 2 chapters, or a handful of chapters like in FE8, Fates' route split is basically the entire game. After a set of tutorial chapters, you choose Conquest, Birthright, or Revelation, and that determines the story you experience and the maps that you play for the rest of the game. I'm going to be focusing mainly on Birthright and Conquest here, because it's been a long time since I played Revelation, and I think the differences between Birthright and Conquest are very interesting. The narrative differences are obvious. You choose whether you want to side with Corrin's birth family or the family they grew up with, leading to a different aesthetic, narrative, units, and more. If you wanted to, you could do a whole series on all of the differences between these games. The interesting one to me is their broad approach to game design. Birthright takes a simpler approach where there are fewer map gimmicks and the ones that exist are generally less complicated, and enemies have less skills. Fates can be a pretty complicated game, and Birthright can be a good way to ease into it, or even a good way to ease into the series if you find a lot of skills or some of the gimmicks in Conquest to be a little too complex. On the other hand, Conquest really embraces the game's systems. It includes a lot of enemies with skills, and it experiments with map gimmicks like wind that blows you around, or map conditions that you or the boss can switch between buffing flyers or buffing non-flyers. For people that are really interested in Fates' systems and are interested in enemies making use of that system just like the player does, Conquest is very neat. I think designing 2 routes in such different ways was an interesting approach to this game. If you're going to basically make 2 different games, it makes sense to use that as an opportunity to appeal to different gameplay preferences. And while I do prefer Conquest, I think it's cool that the 2 games use the same underlying mechanics to create different experiences. Unfortunately, I just don't know that people were taking that into consideration when they picked which route they want to play, versus considering which characters and which aesthetic they like better, which could lead to them getting the gameplay experience that they don't prefer. I have a couple friends that definitely prefer the gameplay pitch of Birthright, for example, but started with Fates Conquest anyway because they were more interested in the Fates Royals than the Birthright Royals. I'm not going to rate this route split with the other ones, as in my mind this is less of a traditional route split and more of a IS made 3 games at the same time situation, particularly since the routes are literally sold separately. If you just buy one, there's no split at all. You can only make one choice. So I guess technically speaking, you do pick your route, you just make your route choice at the point of purchase, rather than at any point in the narrative. Unless you manage to get your hands on the special edition that has all of the games in one cartridge, of course. But I think the way they designed these games differently is cool. The last game we're going to talk about is one of the more controversial route splits in Fire Emblem, and that's in 3 houses. In this game, you pick from one of 3 houses almost immediately, which determines your entire starting roster of units and changes several maps in the second half of the game. One of the routes also splits halfway through, making for a total of 4 routes in 3 houses. Map-wise, the first half of the game is largely the same regardless of which house you choose. However, having access to a completely different set of units still changes how the first half of the game plays. For example, if you go with the Golden Deer, early access to Warp on Lysithea can make you approach maps in ways that you maybe wouldn't on a Blue Lions playthrough. Regardless of which house you pick, you can recruit most characters regardless of which house you're in, so the gameplay can end up feeling pretty samey after the first few chapters if you choose to recruit the same favorite units each playthrough. But you'll always at least have one unique unit in your Lord, and you'll probably use at least some of the in-house units on each playthrough. Of course, the route split in 3 houses isn't just about its mechanics, it also has a huge impact on the story. Even in the first half where you play through the same sequence of major events, each route gives you a different perspective on them, which informs the conflict in the second half of the game. Even though gameplay-wise, each route may not be as distinct as one might expect, the narrative differences alone were enough to compel a lot of folks to blaze through 4 playthroughs of the game. I think that last point is the main reason this route split is somewhat contentious among fans. It's often said that you need to play through the game 4 times to get the story, and that this gets repetitious. And I sort of disagree. I mean, I do agree that if you do 4 straight playthroughs of 3 houses, it's going to feel a little repetitive, but I don't actually think you need to do 4 playthroughs to have a playthrough of 3 houses that feels like it tells a cohesive story. After your first playthrough, the other 3 are mostly going to be adding new perspectives and lore, but I think each route stands alone fine. While the game is enhanced by playing multiple routes, I did not feel unsatisfied after finishing my first one. I do think that having 4 routes in the game puts some constraints on how unique each route could be, especially from a gameplay perspective though. While I like all of them, I also wonder if it were a 2 or 3 route game instead of 4, if maybe Crimson Flower would have gotten a few more chapters, or if each route would have had a few less shared maps. I also wonder if limitations on how many out-of-house students you could recruit would have made the routes feel a little more distinct gameplay-wise. Outside of your Lord and a small selection of units, by the middle of Part 1, you can feasibly have the same team for every route of the game that you play. If there were restrictions on how many out-of-house students you could recruit, it would make each run play a little differently by nature of giving you different units to work with. Plus, I think Act 2 hits a lot harder if you have to fight some of the units that you like but didn't recruit in Act 1. On the other hand, the heavy customizability both of units and your army as a whole is a big part of the appeal of 3 houses, so this would be a change with a meaningful trade-off. I would argue that where this route split really excels is in enhancing your first playthrough. The hook is just really strong. You're forced to make an early decision that will lock you out of certain units, some of whom you may end up really liking throughout the story. It's not uncommon that people wish they picked a different house partway through, and I think that works to the game's strength and adds to the emotion when the houses come into conflict in the second half of the game. The hook for this route split is so strong that which house is the best is still one of the most discussed topics in the series, for better or for worse. I don't think any route split has been discussed or considered as much as this one. People really identify with the house that they choose in 3 houses in a way that they don't seem to in other games in the series. I'm not going to go over map quality for this game since the route split is functionally the entire game, but since you get all of the routes in this game in a single purchase, I will rate it overall. This one is super ambitious, and while I wish there were more unique maps per route, and there are certainly quibbles I have with each route, the highs outweigh the lows for me, particularly when I play runs where I restrict myself to a small number of out-of-house recruitments. Still, I don't like it quite as much as Sacred Stone's route split, so I'm gonna put it in the banger category, right next to Thracia. Route splits aren't a make or break in Fire Emblem for me, but I'm pretty fond of them. I feel like route splits have recently been blamed for a lot of narrative criticisms of Fire Emblem, particularly in Three Houses and Fates, but I think that it's been scapegoated a bit. In Three Houses, I think the narrative overall is actually quite strong, and forcing you to choose a house and fight the other ones that you could have chosen adds emotional weight to Act 2 that would be difficult to replicate without a route split. And I also think a lot of the frustrations people have with stuff like Those Who Slither in the Dark might not even be better without a route split. And as for Fates, well, I'm not super fond of the story in that game, but I just don't think the route split was the issue. Without the route split, I'm not convinced that any of the issues I have with the writing would be solved, but we would be denied some games that I think are really fun and highly distinct in gameplay and aesthetic, which I think is valuable. Personally, I do hope Intelligent Systems continues doing route splits. Not every game needs to be a full game route split. Obviously, that presents a lot of challenges, but I think FE games are often improved by smaller route splits, even if there's just 1 or 2 chapters, that introduce some choice and variety to a playthrough. But what do you think? Are you a fan of route splits, or would you rather them go away? Which one's your favorite? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you liked the video, consider leaving a like or subscribe so that you never miss an upload, or hop in the community Discord linked in the video description if you want to chat about Fire Emblem more. And a big shout out to my super skinks, Lonely Voxel and the Noodle Doodler, along with my geckos and my other skinks, Marms, Nepsit, Muted Miami, Doopy, Stars to Art, Wingman, Upscale Furry Trash, Lonely Voxel, Cosplay Sylveon, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Emma, Aaron Gedden, Red Mage Morgan, N6, and Punch Fighter Champion. If you want to support the channel, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Either way, thank you for hanging out till the end of the video, and I hope you have yourself a lovely week.